So let's take a tour of the offer to purchase real estate packet with an in depth walkthrough of the actual forms used by real estate professionals. As we walk through the forms, this will give us an opportunity to also highlight negotiation trigger points. So let's begin with the offer to purchase real estate contract. This is the form promulgated by the Greater Boston Real Estate Board. There is a similar form promulgated by the Massachusetts Association of Realtors called the Contract to Purchase Real Estate. The spirit of the two are essentially the same. Let's start at the top left. The offer is addressed and written to the seller. However, you do not need to know the owner's name. Oftentimes, you'll see owner of record followed by the property address. Depending on the amount of dialogue you have with a buyer's agent or buyer who is writing the offer ahead of it actually being presented to you, and then for later sharing with your client, an owner name rather than owner of record could be used. And also keep in mind, with some dialogue ahead of an offer presentation, you can set expectations with the buyer's agent as to what you expect in the offer packet and an initial attempt to align to some of the big milestones of the transaction that a seller wants. Perhaps the seller needs to close by a certain date or can't close until a certain date. You'll see that the offer to purchase will be dated along with the buyer's agent's brokerage name. The first several paragraphs of the offer are used to call out everything that is included in the sale. Buyer's agents will use this area of the contract to protect a buyer by ensuring that everything they saw during a showing will convey with the property sale unless specifically excluded by the seller. Some agents go so far as to take pictures of appliances, note down their model numbers, etc., so that correct items convey. Section number 1 outlines price. The initial $1,000 earnest money deposit, coupled with the additional purchase and sale agreement deposit, most oftentimes equals 5% of the purchase price. For a simple example, let's say the purchase price is $100,000. Just work backward, knowing that 5% of 100K is $5,000. With the $1,000 earnest money deposit, you would expect to see an additional $4,000 deposit at the time of P&S signing. Section number 2 outlines how long you make your offer good for. If you are in a relatively tight and competitive situation, it may be reasonable to make the offer valid until noon of the next day or perhaps 12 hours. Or I've seen an offer expire during the evening hours when an offer is submitted in the morning. However, if it's not a tight or competitive situation, I typically see an offer valid between 24 to 48 hours. How long is more an art than a science, and also largely a function of trying to be respectful of the seller and practically accommodating to a seller as well. Perhaps the seller is out of the country, for instance, and can only respond by a certain date. Again, this is the kind of information that would probably surface during an initial conversation between you and a buyer's agent if they give you the courtesy of a heads up that an offer is coming. Section 3 outlines when the parties will sign the purchase and sale agreement, or P&S. As we outlined in the previous module with the transaction timeline, this is typically 10 business days following offer acceptance. Section 4 outlines the proposed closing date. There are several factors that guide this date. The one with the largest impact is typically financing, if the buyer plans to utilize financing. This date can be pushed out 4 to 8 weeks from the offer acceptance date. That aside, a tip from a seasoned expert: do not close on a Monday, a Friday, and for that same reason, not on either side of a holiday. There are so many things that must come together for a successful closing, and you give yourself the best chance for the entire team Keep in mind, it's not just you, it's not just your seller. There are many people behind the scenes bringing a deal to close. But you give the best chance for the entire team to button up a deal and bring it over the finish line, to be firing on all cylinders when there's runway before and after your closing date. Section 5 outlines what entity will hold the earnest money deposits in escrow. Deposits are typically held in escrow by either the listing brokerage or the seller's real estate attorney. Section number 8 of the offer to purchase, the standard language most typically used here is something to the effect of subject to buyer's attorney's satisfactory review of condo documents and budget prior to P&S agreement, subject to attached contingency and condominium document addendum. Naturally, that will be edited depending on the property type and contingencies leveraged by the buyer. This is followed by signature block areas, and then at the bottom of the contract, there's an area to capture detailed information about the receipt of the earnest money deposit. You can fill this out and share an updated copy of the document with the buyer's agent once you obtain the actual earnest money deposit check. While this is not consistently utilized by all real estate agents, it's a good practice to have the information documented in writing and shared with all parties. To take a step back, anecdotally, most initial offers are not accepted as is. There's typically some back and forth negotiation. That back and forth essentially represents a set of counteroffers. While it's in good practice to continue to keep all of those counteroffers in writing, what oftentimes does occur in practice is counteroffers will be conducted verbally, and once the terms of an agreement are settled, the buyer's agent will write up a clean offer with everything that was agreed upon, and all parties will sign that contract. So that concludes our look at the offer to purchase real estate contract. This single page contract is most oftentimes accompanied by various contingency addenda. And the first one that we'll look at is the offer to purchase contingency addendum, which gives the buyer the option to request contingencies around a mortgage, an inspection, radon, pest, and lead paint. Essentially, if a buyer checks any of these contingency, the offer will be bound by that contingency. So let's go over these so you get the hang of it. If the mortgage contingency is used, the buyer is signaling to you and your seller that they need financing to purchase the property. The mortgage contingency will outline the amount of financing needed, the date of the loan commitment, and when the buyer must submit an official loan application. With the amount of financing, you can extrapolate the amount the buyer is planning to put down on the property, and often we'll see a percentage used rather than an exact value in this field here. For instance, 95% of the purchase price rather than a specific dollar amount. This makes things a little more reusable for you because if you go back and forth negotiating on price, you won't have to keep making slight adjustments to the loan value. To reiterate on dates, you'll want the buyer to submit an official loan application no later than 1 day after the P&S signing, and the bank commitment letter is typically 2 weeks following the signing of the P&S and up to 45 days after in some cases, and will follow the appraisal. The inspection contingency is nearly always invoked. In this contingency, you're looking at the date by which the inspection needs to take place, the amount of money the buyer is allowing for defect remediation, defects identified in the inspection, and the date by which the buyer has the option to revoke the offer based on their interpretation of the inspection report. All of this needs to take place before the signing of the purchase and sale agreement. Anecdotally, $500 and $1,000 are oftentimes used in the amount field, yet because an inspector will never cite defect remediation prices in a report, it's quite arbitrary. Clearly, the inspection contingency puts the power in the buyer's hands. The other contingencies are structured quite similarly. A date by which a test, inspection, or the like needs to take place, and the date by which a buyer needs to inform you if they were to revoke their offer. At the bottom of this addendum, you'll see an area for signatures of both the buyer and seller. And here we have the condominium documents addendum. What you're seeing here is a buyer requesting access to copies of condo docs, HOA budget, meeting minutes if available, all by a certain number of days following offer acceptance. And you'll see the date by which the buyer would need to give notice and inform the seller if they were going to revoke their offer based upon these documents. You'll see a large blank space underneath the condominium documents addendum, and we've seen this used for other similar addendum to be placed onto the offer to purchase contract as a whole. And then below this, you'll have signature blocks for both the buyer as well as the seller. There are other contingency addendum that theoretically could be attached to the offer to purchase, perhaps a septic addendum, if you will. One small tip: if you do have a small correction in these offer to purchase documents, typically a change can be made by striking through whatever piece of information you're trying to correct and having both the buyer as well as the seller initial that change. And now here we have a view of the Massachusetts mandatory licensee consumer relationship disclosure document. And again, this is a disclosure document signed between the buyer and the buyer's agent. And this is something that you should be requesting as part of your offer to purchase packet. Essentially, what this document lays out is the fact that a buyer's agent is representing a buyer via a certain type of relationship. Both the buyer's agent as well as the buyer needs to sign this document at the first material discussion of property. And so that concludes our detailed walkthrough of the standard offer to purchase packet forms. As you can see, as we go through these documents, offers can become weaker or stronger based on the contingencies that are involved in that offer. Clearly, the addition of more contingencies to an offer to purchase decreases the strength of that offer. And so, as we begin to pull together the timeline, all of the documents, the various pieces of these documents that you'll be signing and negotiating against, hopefully all of this now starts to come together for you. And you can start to see that if you were to receive an all cash offer on your property, that would significantly decrease the timeline of that offer and the transaction process, but also significantly reduces your risk and exposure throughout the transaction timeline.